Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you may happen to be, and whether you're watching live or archived. And welcome to episode number 71 of the Nautel Transmission Talk Tuesday webinar series. I'm your host, Jeff Welton, and we're going to have a little bit of fun. Got the first comment coming in already, so we'll definitely have some fun. Apologies for the late start. We had some technical challenges. It wouldn't be right otherwise, but it's going to be kind of a cool one today. I've got the special guest who I don't think I've had on one of these sessions before, although I've known him for a few years. We've got Josh Jones. He's Chief Technician with the Max Connect Group. Josh, welcome. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having me today.
So again, so you do, so your official title's Chief Technician, but you do board work, you do field work, you do a little bit of everything it takes to skin the cat, if I'm not mistaken.
That's correct. We kind of try and keep the skill set diversified, I guess you could say. So yeah, we do installs, we do board level repair, retrofits, basically whatever we need to do. So we're kind of hired guns for a lot of things.
Yeah, and I know that Josh Bowen has mentioned before that you've done some redesigns on like amplifiers for some of our older gear where it's getting a little challenging to get parts and stuff.
Yes, we've had to do some of that for some of the STL stuff. A lot of the older STLs, the Mosleys, the Martys, stuff like that, particularly the composite systems used monolithic amplifier modules that we can't source anymore. So we've, in some cases, had to find substitutes, and the sad thing is, some of those we're going to run out of spares for pretty soon too, so we're no longer going to be able to support those either.
Yeah, and that's an ongoing challenge, especially today with the logistics we deal with. I mean, you find a part 3 days later, you can't get that same part again.
Yes, and one thing that we have all seen through COVID and all what's been going on over the last couple of years is that's gotten progressively worse. Because the little mom and pop shops that used to be able to provide some of these parts, a lot of those places closed. They're not around anymore. So what used to be a viable option isn't a viable option anymore.
Right, and we had that talk before about crystals. I mean, when we always used Crovin. You guys, I think you were saying, used ICM International, and I mean, you could get them in a hurry. You paid through the nose for it, and the reliability kind of went down with the speed of delivery because aging and all that. But again, I mean, you're down to like crystals. You're not down. You don't have too many sources anymore. It used to be there were 3 or 4 in the world, and now we got like 1.
Pretty much, yeah. And I mean, even your OEMs now are sourcing that stuff from overseas because there's just nobody else domestically that's making it anymore. The world's moved on, and I mean, direct FM is kind of a thing of the past, at least for the kind of the stuff that we play with. So, your Martys, some of your older TV stuff, which doesn't really matter anymore because it's all gone digital. But the direct FM stuff where they directly modulated the crystal, that stuff's gone. And I mean, in the world of FM exciters, we've had frequency synthesis for a long time now. DDS is starting to take over. So crystals are kind of a dying thing.
Yeah, and I mean, even beyond that, I mean, most of the higher end stuff is direct to channel now, so it's not synthesized at all. Even it's just you still have a crystal for the computer clock, but that's about it.
Yeah, it's some flavor of DDS or DSP on the inside. So that's the way everything is now.
Right, and that's kind of leading into our topic, and so I've left the cover slide up because site improvements on a budget. I guess before we get rolling too much further, seeing as we're 5 minutes into it already, we should do the mandatory housekeeping stuff. If you're an SBE member, this Nautel webinar, as with all Nautel webinars, qualifies for half of a recertification credit under category I of the SBE research schedules. So grab your notepad or your PDF or PDA or Palm Pilot. There we go. Now I'm dating myself. But whatever you happen to use to keep track of that sort of thing, jot it down and don't forget to log it in. If you're not an SBE member, well, why not? Maybe we should probably do an SBE session someday and talk about some of the value in there. And I mean, I'm kind of, I guess I'm not really a conflict, but I'm on the SBE education committee, and I think it's a value the SBE can provide that we need to tweak. Andy mentions, let me get my Palm Pilot out of my junk drawer. So there's the other thing. We do make these as interactive as we possibly can. So on your little control panel, you got a place to type questions. You type a question there, comment, criticism, concerns, sarcasm, snark, any of the above. If I don't put it on the screen, understand that I will be judging you under my breath. But either way, feel free to put that stuff on there. Dan mentions, I'm curious to see what the budget part is about. Budget is a word he's heard before, but not in the world of broadcast engineering and preventative maintenance. And that kind of ties back to the advanced questions that we had. But before I get to that, one other thing, in the interest of making things interactive, there is a little hand wavy icon there. And if you click that little hand raise button, it will pop something up on my screen. And hopefully I'll actually see it, unmute you, and make you part of the conversation. So let's roll with that, have a little bit of fun. We did get some advanced comments, and I don't typically attribute names to these, although the radio station vehicle was an interesting one. I mean, especially the short bus, that made kind of, my mind went to comments that don't necessarily fit into the realm of political correctness. So I won't go any further down that road, but William had mentioned there's never time to do it right, but there's always time to do it twice. And that kind of ties into Dan's budget comment. And there's something that I'll ask you, Josh, because you kind of end up in front of the customers probably more than I do in a lot of ways. How do you, I guess sell them is probably the right word, but how do you impress upon them the need to invest the time and or resources to do something right the first time?
Well, I mean, it depends on the situation, I suppose. From a repair aspect, we have like kind of a baseline service that we offer. So it's like, we'll go through and replace the caps, the dirty switches, the meter lamps, things like that. Usually in STL transmitters, we'll put in a switch mode power supply simply because it helps reduce the heat load in the component in the enclosure, and obviously the cooler you run solid state devices, the longer they last, and that's important in the world where you can't get replacements anymore. Like Marty has been a large part of our business over the last decade, and most of the amplifier components, the transistors, things like that, you can't get anymore. We had a run trying to find a couple of reactors from overseas sources to fix the multiplier modules, and that didn't pan out very well either. So, you're just playing in the world of obsolescence, and you're kind of putting band-aids on it in a lot of cases. So you do what you can, but I mean, at some point you have to accept the fact that this equipment is end of life, and you can't get parts for it, and it's time to replace it because there's a lot of money running through that box every year, and it probably deserves a little more, life than it's got left in it.
And that brings up two really good points. One of the things I beat the drum on, whether you're a station engineer, contract engineer, commercial, non-com, doesn't matter. If you don't know what every station you look after bills or underwrites on an annual basis, so you can break it down to what their value per hour is, then it's hard to make the ROI, the return on investment calculation, as to whether or not this is worth doing or not worth doing.
Yes.
And so, yeah, that's, that comes back to engineering as a management team position aspect that I think we've probably gotten away from. Because, I mean, a lot of times it's easy if you're slam full of stuff and the repair bin is piled to the ceiling with stuff you've got to do, it's easy to get into the this broke, let's get a new one as mindset. But sometimes it's like, well, this broke, maybe we can send it out for repair. We don't use it that often, and it's probably not worth buying a new one.
Yeah, I mean, it depends too. One thing that I advocate to a lot of people is, hang on to your old equipment as backups, particularly if it works, because some watts beats no watts, as the old saying goes, which I stole from our chief engineer. But it's one of those things where if you're backed up against a wall, your main STL's dead, a Marty transmitter will keep you on the air overnight until you can get the parts you need to fix it, or run to another site and snag an STL to get you back on in full service.
Right.
I'm not
Uh,
suggesting that people go out and, bin their old equipment, but, if there's still some life left in it, it makes sense to keep it in the rack as a backup, and make sure you test it regularly too, because there's nothing worse than a backup that doesn't work.
yep. And a backup is only as good as the last time you saw it working.
Yes.
And that brings me to a really good point. And I mean, we keep this non-commercial, but I'm going to give a little plug because it pays your bills too. But Max Connect Group, I mean, those little LTE modems are, I wouldn't want to run 24/7 streaming audio over one because I think the data bill would break me. But
Yes, but we have clients that do.
and in an emergency, it can be the difference between, like you said, having something on the air and not having something on the air.
Absolutely.
So it's sort of like the ubiquity Wi-Fi bridges. I mean, shoot, 20, 30 years ago, you couldn't put together an STL for $1,000. And now you can if you've got an AOIP system, or even if you've just got like a barracks unit to convert audio to IP.
Sure. No,
So,
absolutely.
so moving forward, and that kind of leads me to the last line item on the advanced questions, talking about trades. And one of the things I think that the least expensive thing that I run into when I'm looking at sites, the thing that could be fixed the easiest and is typically ignored the most is groundskeeping. And I mean, like a site like this, if I've got to hack my way through pricker bushes and fighting off chiggers and rattlesnakes, depending on what part of the country I'm in, odds are that whatever I got to get in there to fix is going to cost a whole lot more than if I can just walk in and do the job.
Right. Well, if for nothing else in the frustration factor, but keep in mind too, a site that looks like that is going to, say to vandals, hey, nobody ever comes here. This might be a good place to try and rip some metal out of or something like that. A clean site that looks like it's well maintained is probably going to be not vandalized as much as one that looks like, the back end of the jungle somewhere.
Yeah. And I've got going back to our repair, or always cheaper to do something stuff or do something twice than to do it right. Or sorry, always time to do it twice, but never time to do it right. And somebody who asked to be unnamed mentioned that the multi-station group that they work with is waiting on a replacement transmitter after a lightning strike, and that all of a sudden they're in significant agreement with previous recommendations for doing some upgrades to the grounding and lightning protection at the sites.
Hmm.
And and I mean, sometimes that is true. I mean, and it's true of all of us. Sometimes you just don't learn something until it blows up in your face and you say, whoops, guess I should address that.
Yeah.
You know, a prime example, I mean, somebody who looks a lot like me had a low tire warning coming up on their truck for several days in a row. And well, not days in a row, but the low tire alarm would come up. So replace or put the air in the tire, low tire alarm come up, top it off next time I get gas. So slow leak, probably a rim leak, whatever, and probably could have been addressed pretty easily, except that there was never time to get around to it. And then, because every time a tire collapses like that, you're weakening the sidewall.
Yep.
And you discover that when you're going down the road at 70 miles an hour and that front tire blows that sidewall, and all of a sudden now it becomes a little more of a, let's just say it was an underwear changing moment. And
Yeah.
and so those tires are well, all the tires have been replaced because you kind of, well, I think I bought the exact same model, so it might have been just that one now. This was a year or so ago. But anyway, now if I get a low tire warning, I'll top it off. And if that same tire warning comes back in a week or two, it's going to the dealer to figure out, okay, what's leaking? Fix this.
Right.
So yeah. Um, Now here's a good question from Curtis. What's the point that you decide to replace instead of repairing? Because every engineer has a different opinion on this. The old folks want to repair everything, and the young folks want to replace everything. And you kind of qualify as a young folk, but you fit pretty close in the middle on that, if I'm not mistaken.
I suppose so. I, I have to talk to people on the phone all the time about, we've got this, you've sent in this piece of equipment. It's got problems, and the more technologically complicated something is, the more points of failure there are. And some of those things age well, some of them don't. The Martys usually, if you just kind of keep kicking them down the road, keep tuning them up here and there, they'll kind of keep going for a while until a crystal drifts out of alignment or ages out of spec, and you can't pull it back in, or the distortion goes through the roof. There's all kinds of things that can go wrong. Mosley's, for some reason, they used a glue that holds these foam pads on the insides of the modules to keep the resonances down, to keep the spurious emission down. And that glue over time starts to degrade and cause corrosion of the metal components, and so the filters will start to decompose. The plastic inside the filters will start to decompose. And
Wow.
when you start getting into that realm, I mean, yeah, we can throw filters at it, but you're dealing with an STL that's already 30 years old.
Right.
At some point, you need to make the call and accept the fact that, yeah, it's not going to last 40 years like the old one did. You should probably think about replacing it.
Yeah, and,
So,
and
and,
that's
and
one of those situations too, where if it's still working and can be repaired, you replace it. And having the old one assigned to backup duty is best done while it's still working,
yes,
not after it's gone past the point of no return, so to speak.
right. And that's the big, like we were talking earlier about parts obsolescence. That's the big problem now. So if it's working and it doesn't need a PA module or a crystal or something like that, yeah, okay, we can refurb it, but you should probably think about replacing it with something sooner than later,
Yeah.
because every time you take the lid off something, it gets a little more dependent on maintenance for some reason. It's like once you disturb its innards, it kind of gets all angry and it says, okay, you know,
Mm-hmm.
it
Yeah.
starts sending you the red flags that, I'm not long for this world.
Let's do something, and sooner
Mhm.
rather than later. Yep. And I'm going to unmute Dan Gunter is in the audience, and Dan's put in a couple of things here. So Dan, you're unmuted if you want to hit your mute button and open your mic. But one of the things you'd mentioned in here was, in the words of a late consulting friend, you ever been too busy driving to stop and get gas? And I want you to expand on that just a little bit. And let's see. So Dan's green, but I'm not hearing you, Dan. Nope, unmuted, but not working. So Dan, if you get it working, just holler at me. I'll leave you unmuted and just break right in. But you made another good point. Sometimes, like you had a situation where it would have been X amount in parts versus 2 times X for a new box, but the delivery time on the parts versus the new box was the tipping point. And yeah, it does all come back to time versus money, because the two, well, I mean, time is money, quite literally, right?
Yep, absolutely. We have that conversation a lot with people, and they, talk to any major market engineer, and they'll stick their finger and point at that transmitter and say 2 or 10 or 20 million dollars goes through that box every year, or in a really big market maybe every month or something, who knows. But that's why those guys have backup sites, backup antennas, backup transmitters, backup power supplies, backup STLs, everything, because
Yeah,
everything relies on that staying on. It's a
yeah.
little different if you're a smaller market. Maybe the audience will forgive you if you're off for an hour here or there because something broke, but it's just the way it is.
Right.
So it
But
again, it all boils down to your whole, what's the time worth? What's the airtime worth?
yeah, and that kind of comes back to the original point that I was raising with the photo on the screen, is a lot of this stuff can be traded out. Air conditioning maintenance companies come out, they'll clean your condenser coils a couple times a year for a shout out
Sure,
on the radio,
sure.
or whatever, or a landscaping company to come out and do some basic mowing and maybe weed prevention.
Yep,
So,
absolutely.
yeah, definitely talk to the folks that you're already dealing with, because in a lot of ways you may, I mean, this is an industry that was quite literally built on trade. I've had folks try to trade me new transmitters. Now, I'm here to tell you, me being on the air in an unrated market in a fairly small community, probably not something that you're going to be able to sell me on, because how many, if you're the only radio station in town, then advertising a transmitter manufacturer on the air isn't a big benefit to us.
No,
But definitely it never hurts to ask. Um, and time, John makes a good point here. Time is money, and it doesn't matter whether you're commercial or non-commercial. In the commercial world, it's a very direct correlation because advertising dollars per hour, per day, per month, per year, per minute. I mean, we had way back in the day, I was training some new service techs, and we were really beating the drum on the on turnaround time, on returning calls faster. And it's a conversation we need to have every now and again. And I picked one of the top 10 billing stations in the US, and I forget which one now, it might have been KIIS at the time. And I took what they billed per year in LA and divided it down to the minute. And I said, $600 a minute. That's what it's worth to these folks. That's what they're losing every minute they're waiting for you to pick up the phone. So yeah, it's, it is significant. And obviously now I didn't bother telling the support guys that in their case, they had, like you say, layers on layers of redundancy and backup. And if they're totally off the air, something catastrophic happened that we're probably not going to resolve in 30 seconds on the phone anyway.
right,
But you do need to attach a sense of priority to it. And
sure.
that's a big deal.
Well,
Now,
and keep in mind too. I mean, you're dealing with, especially in major markets, they count the seconds per year that they're off the air, and that's kind of a badge of pride for a lot of those guys. We were only off for 3 seconds last year or something. I mean,
yeah.
there's a lot to be said for that level of redundancy.
I worked with one guy once, and this was a lot of years ago when the industry was quite a bit different than it is now. But his part of his employment contract was that, uh-oh, that sounds like Dan almost got back up.
My apologies, Jeff. It was an external speaker and no microphone issue.
That'll do it. Okay, so I've got a little echo, so I'm going to shut up. But tell me about what you were talking about before with the time to. You ever been so busy driving you didn't have time to get gas?
Oh, that was just something that the late Dr. Stephen Covey, I had the pleasure of knowing. He's a big business and leadership consultant. That was one of his favorite little things when he was talking about being proactive about things. He would always open up and he looked over and say, "Ever been too busy driving to stop and get gas?" Yeah,
Yeah.
he was big on that type of thing. But it was sometimes a little something like that makes people think a little bit.
Yeah. Now I'll throw that the other way because I've been the guy I challenge it. So I'll take a rental car out, get the fuel option, and let's see how accurate this D to E calculator really is. And I reeled into I think it was either St. Louis or Omaha, but somewhere in the Midwest. I wheeled into the Avis return lot, and as I pulled past over the little tire wrecking rack, and hit in. It was a good thing there was a slight downhill slope because I popped in neutral as it stalled, and I rolled up to the accountant or the clerk, and with the brake on, they go, "Going to need to start the car so I get the mileage." I said, "This car ain't going to start again until you bring a can of gas for it." But yeah, it's a good point. You really don't want to play that fast and loose with the thing that, as Josh said, is bringing in all the revenue. Now, Dan, and say you've done a lot, and we've had a lot of discussions on grounding over the years. But what are some of the things that you do encounter that folks could probably get fixed on a more, on a budget without before it goes to needing a new box?
Well, a lot of the things are things that I think I've seen in your webinars lately, your guests talking about. For example, those big bus bars on the wall, it's a good idea every once in a while to go over there and give the cable a little tug, especially if it doesn't have a 2-bolt lug. If it's loose, check it, clean the contacts, put a little Noah locks on there. In the case of one that I'm dealing with right now, really it boiled down to, I knew they'd had vandalism over the years, but nobody ever looked and noticed that about 1 foot of the copper strap on the floor of the building was missing. which did away with, well, basically what happened, um, ground cable on the back of the transmitter was not actually hooked to anything. So when lightning hit that nice lightning rod mounted up atop the tower, the chassis and the neutral became the ground for Lord knows how many volts and amps, and it didn't play well. And they also had lost the tower. I mean, they lost an STL at that site not a few months before. The tower lighting system was all damaged. MOVs were not recognizable anymore. And so the transmitter's not the only thing that's getting changed. I mean, there's a lot of stuff, but I had already been rounding up and making lists telling them, you know, we need to beef up the grounding and there's some work needs to be done. And now it can't get done fast enough.
Yep.
It's amazing.
And
I've got about the next 2 weeks. Most of it's going to be spent working on their grounding systems. The electrician and I are going to be meeting tomorrow because I looked in their breaker panel. And what did I find? I found neutrals and grounds over there on the grounding bar. And this is a secondary panel technically. And I'm like, no, we got to separate those and unbond that. We're going to do this right. And they're quite in favor of it now.
And it's amazing how perspectives change after things go up in flames. And I mean, this picture on the screen here, site I walked into because they'd been having some repeated amplifiers or power supplies, one of the two, but something was blowing up on a regular basis. And so I walk in, look at the transmitter, look in the building, and again, it's one of those situations. Everything in the building looked fine. So we walk around outside and I look and it's like, I see your problem, I think.
Yeah, well,
So,
can I share too, Jeff, the situation, I think it was yesterday I shared with you. I've got one client that a translator site, as I mentioned to you, we've lost now the third barracks box, at least 4 Wi-Fi routers, several modems, which are the cable companies to replace. And finally, enough was enough. I said, I told the CEO, I said, we're going to go out and take a look. Went out there and found that the cable company's installer had been smart enough to run that green jacketed ground wire, but he grounded it to an electrical box that has no ground wire to it, and power company cut all of the cables loose from it years ago. And so I'm looking down about 1.5 feet to the left of my left foot, standing there at that box at the not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 ground rods around that tower.
yep.
Going, you know, if this guy had been a little conscientious, but then again, I wanted to kind of kick myself because it's like when they put that in last year, it would have probably behooved me to walk out there and make sure they did it right. You know, trust but verify.
And that's a really big one. I mean, especially if you're dealing with contract folks, you know, they may know their industry really well, but they don't necessarily know our industry really well. And yeah, so Dan, I want to thank you for your time on that. That was useful, and definitely it is one of those things that it really points to the need to walk out there and do a physical inspection every now and again, and preferably not when things blow up and you got some priority, you know, because of course, once you're off the air, it's a much bigger deal. Tim makes a comment in the questions that the best program in the world isn't worth crap if nothing's coming out the end of the antenna. Oh, one other thing, and we got talking, and I beat this drum a lot, and Josh, I'm sure you've seen this, but radio station temporary. You know, I mean, how often do you run in and I mean, AMs, you know, being held together with vice grips or ground systems, or my all-time favorite, the tie wrap grounds to the right, which I like to think hope is just a joke, but I'm afraid it probably isn't.
Yeah, it gives a whole new meaning to the term on a wing and a prayer, but we see that a lot. I mean, especially now with AMs, because nobody wants to spend money on them anymore, because the only reason the AM is still on is to keep the transmitter or the translator going. And to your point earlier about the whole grounding disappearing and all that stuff, I worked briefly for a TV station, and out the back door we had a 300-foot self-supporting tower that had STL dishes for the ring of stations that this station fed. And there was a 50 kilowatt AM. It wasn't 50 kilowatts when they built the site, but they upgraded. And all of a sudden we had RF in the telephone system, the headphones, the IFB, some of the program feeds for the station. And that should have been a red flag that there's a big problem. And we chased it. The station engineers came out and put ferrites on some stuff, but it never really went away. And I parted ways with the station, and about 2 months after I left, a storm came rolling through town one afternoon, and they took a direct strike to that tower, and they found out the hard way that all the lines coming into the building weren't grounded to anything. They lost a production switcher, they lost cameras, camera control modules, the phone system, just about every network switch in the place got blown up. I mean, you're talking probably the better part of $1 million worth of damage, all because all that Keeliax coming into the back of the building wasn't grounded to anything.
Yep.
That was
And
a very expensive lesson for them.
that's a really good point. I was at the Nebraska Broadcasters Convention, I want to say 4 or 5 years ago now, might be a little more, a little less. But the guy came up to me and he goes, "Yeah, I got a question on grounding and shielding and ferrites and stuff," because that was a presentation I'd done. And turned out he was he wasn't a broadcast facility. He was talking about a data center. And they'd been losing a lot of switches during storms. And so we ran through single point grounded. We swapped some emails and some ideas back and forth over the next few years. And he reached out to me a year or so later and said, "Just want to let you know we implemented some of what we talked about." He said some we couldn't just because of logistics or the geography, the physics of the building, but we implemented a lot of it. And he goes, "Our failure rate's gone from several switches a storm to one switch every few storms." So he said, "It's, we're saving $45,000-$50,000 a year now." And it's like, I said, "Well, I'd make the argument you're not saving it so much as you're not spending it anymore on stuff that you were blowing up needlessly." But,
Yes.
but the logistics is the same. It's still money in the bank that wasn't in the bank previously.
Sure.
So, and again, it's like you said before, it's easy to make this argument. And like we were talking about with Dan, it's easy to make this argument after the stuff's blown up. It's a whole lot harder to sell it before the stuff blows up because it's like, "Oh, nothing's gone wrong. Why do we need this stuff?"
Yep.
I guess it's like insurance. You never need it till you don't have it.
Yeah, that's truth.
So on the picture earlier with the missing bulkhead, John made the point in the comments that at least the lightning will be directed toward grounds because the wires were pointed down. So I guess that counts. Now, one of the other things, and you have got an HVAC background in some ways.
Yeah, I dabble in it. I've got my EPA certificate, and I can buy Freon and fix equipment when I have to, and I've put in a few systems here and there.
So I've got some air filters showing, which of course forced air is one thing, but HVAC with condenser coils and radiator fins and liquid cooled transmitter systems with heat exchangers, you need to clean this stuff now and again. And you were telling me a story earlier about that.
Yeah, I was working at a site recently, and this is in a pretty arid part of the country where it routinely gets to 110, 115 degrees during the day in the summer. And I walked into the site, and this is another good point. Make it a priority to learn what's normal about your sites. When you walk in, listen, feel things, touch things. Does this feel hot? Does that not sound right? Maybe you have a bearing in a motor that's going out or something like that, but use your senses. You've got them, you might as well use them because it'll wind up saving your butt more often than not. But anyway, I walked into the site and just out of curiosity, walked over to the air handler and stuck my hand over the top of it. Noticed that the air coming out wasn't very cool. And general rule of thumb, on a typical air conditioner, you should have 15 to 20 degrees of delta from input to output. So if 80-degree air is going in, you should have, 65 or 60-degree air coming out. If you don't, you should probably examine why. But anyway, notice that the air coming out wasn't very cool. And I'm like, doesn't seem right. So I walked outside and walked up to the condenser, and there was not a lot of air coming out of the top of it. The air that was coming out was pretty hot. And I leaned down and tried to look through the fins and couldn't see anything. And usually you should be able to see some light through the fins. And
Hmm.
talked to the engineer and I said, "Are you going to the hardware store by chance?" And he said, "Yeah." I said, "Get a hose and a sprayer." So he came back and we hosed that thing out, and the stuff that came out of it looked like coffee. And sure as sure as you would believe, that thing was blowing nice cold air by the time we hosed all the crap out of it.
Yeah.
So maintenance is very important with air conditioners. The other thing too, I grabbed the liquid line, which is the little line coming out of the condenser, and it almost burned my hand. That's a
Hmm.
warning sign too. If it's that hot, it's too hot.
Yeah. And that's a really good point. And so let's see. Curtis asked and said, not exactly on topic, but is really kind of. So, what are your thoughts on mini splits at a transmitter site? And the first thing, I'll go first on that. The only issue I've got with mini splits is that most of them have the intake and the exhaust reversed for what we need for transmitter, because they shoot the cool air out top and let it waft down, which is great for an office or a home, but terrible for a transmitter where it wants to see the cool air go in down low and shoot hot air out the top. But beyond that, what are your thoughts?
The biggest problem with mini splits is so most of them aren't installed correctly and they have a propensity to leak. Because there's so little refrigerant in the systems, you don't need a very large leak before the thing will ice up or stop working. We've had some that just through manufacturing defects, they leak, and you're constantly fighting with them. I personally don't like mini splits because they seem to do a very poor job of dehumidification, because the indoor fan motor is always running. And so every time the compressor shuts off, it's boiling off all the moisture that's sitting on the coil and blowing that back into the room. And that's one of the reasons I prefer conventional split systems, because they seem to have fewer issues in that regard. And generally they're built a little bit better as well, because most of the mini splits that we get, unless you're buying Fujitsu or some of the Japanese brands, most of them are white box specials from China, and they're built to a price point, like everything else.
Yeah. Now, William makes the comment here with the site you were talking about with the air conditioning and the fins that were clogged up. That's fortunately had water. What would you do if you didn't?
I've seen people just try and wash them out with buckets. I mean, it's better than nothing. I have seen actually driller crews, they have these pressurized bottles that you can get. They kind of look like giant fire extinguishers,
Well,
where
and that's
it's got a pump sprayer. You can get those at
yep,
any garden center. Those work great.
right.
Bring
And
a couple
that's
gallons of water. That'll at least get the job done.
well, that's what I was going to say. You can go. I know Home Depot sells these little. Let's see, they're a 2 gallon pump sprayer. And I know this because my wife has one outside,
Mhm.
and they'll get a decent amount of pressure. Let's see. William mentions that they make a foaming spray that you spray it on, and it expands, pushing the dirt out. And I don't know. Does that need to be rinsed off? Don't know.
Yes, it depends on what kind you get. Some of that stuff is very acidic and it can eat the fins if you don't completely rinse it off. So you need to be really careful with coil cleaner, particularly if it's an older unit that's been kind of beat down. Because, and that's another point too. When you do rinse out the fins, don't use too much pressure, because the fins are very, very thin and they're very easy to bend over. And once they're bent, it's very difficult to get them straight again.
Right, and that's a good point too. I learned that lesson the hard way in the back of a refrigerator. Is you can really mess with the efficiency of the system.
Yes.
Let's see. Dan mentioned save that bottle of Dawn dish detergent in the kitchen that's just got a little bit left. Top it with water, squeeze it into the coils, and rinse with a garden pump sprayer of water. So yeah, the same deal. One of those little pump
Yep.
sprayers, and definitely beats doing nothing at all. Um,
Sure.
Another question from scroll up. There it is. William wants to know if you've got any stories about barred wall packs.
I've seen a lot of them around. I mean, usually they just run until they don't.
Yeah, that's true of Generac generators and Ford trucks and pretty much anything else too.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, they're okay. I mean, actually, they were getting fairly expensive to get. So there was a site where we actually just took them off the wall and put plates over the holes and put 2 mini splits in.
Yeah.
And that actually worked out pretty well for that particular location.
Yeah, and that's one of those ones. I guess I could have clicked the size. Two things. Number one, on air conditioners, like with generators, size matters, and you can oversize as well as you can undersize.
Yep, too big is almost as bad as too little.
Yeah, and I'm a big fan, and I've got it shown in the picture here of having a lead lag or a main alternate. But I like lead lag where if you need 6,000 or 6 tons of air conditioner, you put in 2 5-ton units and then just alternate which one's the main
Hmm.
month to month.
Yep,
Because of course, if you need 6 tons in the summer, doesn't mean you're going to need 6 tons in the winter. In our part of the world, you probably need no tons in the winter. And
right.
that ties into something else that John mentions, and John's in Colorado, so he's similar climate to me, only a little more extreme. But good idea to have exhaust fans and sort of again, air conditioning doesn't matter. Air conditioning, AC power, always need backups.
Yep, no,
So
absolutely. And the other thing too, make sure that your equipment is set up for the climate you have. If you expect the air conditioning to run in cold temperatures, make sure it has the low ambient kits installed, because otherwise
mhm,
you're going to be spending a lot of money on compressors over the life of the equipment.
yeah. Alan mentions that they've got a 65-gallon tank and a pump that he uses to haul water to the transmitter sites for the HVAC techs to use to clean units.
Yep.
So yeah, there are a lot of options for that. William is posted, and Ed, if you're still awake in the background, I didn't give my shout out to Mr. Disembodied Voice, Ed Sylvester, the guy that makes us all look well. He doesn't make me look good. I mean, I'm beyond that, but he at least keeps things going. Anyway, so Williams posted a link from Amazon for a Calgon rinse evaporator cleaner. So no rinse, it's no rinse coil cleaner. So we'll throw that in the chat. Have you ever messed with stuff like that before, Josh?
I usually just try and use water.
Yeah.
It's better safe than sorry, and especially the newer high efficiency equipment. It depends on the vendor too, but if it has microchannel condensers in it, be careful too. Sometimes you have to blow the water out of it. Otherwise, the coil will get waterlogged and you can go into a high pressure situation in the compressor and it will shut down. So I think it was York units had microchannel condensers, and it's easy to tell because I mean everybody knows what a conventional condenser fin arrangement looks like. The microchannel ones are very small. It almost kind of looks like the type of fins that are on the front of your air conditioner on your car, where it's a series of flat tubes and then very thin folded pieces of aluminum between it. If you do rinse those out, it's a good idea to go after it with a leaf blower and get the moisture out of it, because otherwise it can get, like I said, it can't pull the air through and it'll
Right.
overheat on you.
Okay.
The other thing I've seen too at a couple of sites is people will harvest the condensation water from the air conditioners and direct it to a rain barrel, and you can use that for cleaning purposes as well.
Oh, that's a good idea too. That's something I wouldn't have thought about. Now, the other thing, and I've beaten this drum a lot, but having enough air in a transmitter building is great. If you're blowing it past the equipment and not through the equipment, doesn't matter. So, where the air goes is probably as important as having enough air to begin with. And
Yes.
this is just an example of a site not too far to your northwest or northeast, I guess, or it was in Arkansas. But you're down in Dallas, right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. But yeah, the this one they blew the air in at ceiling level and took the other air out, and the transmitter basically they're pulling the air away from the transmitter intake on the left-hand picture. So
Yep.
the transmitter's running negative air pressure, everything's overheating, things are failing. And so we rerouted the intake air to go down behind the transmitter, put a little exhaust plenum to pull the air up out of the transmitter. And it was amazing how we dropped the ambient temperature of that box by a lot. Because you can have, I've walked into sites where it was like shivering cold in one portion of the site, and you walk over to the transmitter section in the same room, totally open room, and it'd be 40 degrees warmer
Yep,
because
absolutely.
you get, so yeah, airflow is critical, and that's something else that, again, depending whether you're forced air or air conditioned, usually that's something that's not incredibly expensive to correct.
Nope. And sometimes you don't even have to do anything. Sometimes you can just, depending on the vents that you have on the system, sometimes you can just redirect the vane so that it spreads the air a little better and
Yep.
create, you know, fix some of those dead spots in the room just by getting the air to circulate around.
Hmm. Daryl mentions in Nebraska they have cottonwood seeds to clog filters. Not just Nebraska. That
We have them
picture of
here too. Yep.
the fan filters that I took, there were 3 different stations, one in Minnesota, one in Wisconsin, and one in Michigan, taken over the course of a 2-week trip about 3 weeks, a month ago. And that's exactly what that was. It was cottonwood fluff.
Yep.
So,
At
yep.
the peak of the season here, I have to hose my outdoor units out about twice a season.
Yeah.
So I usually hit it once in the start of the cooling season, and then I'll take a look at it afterwards. And if it's starting to build up, you just hose it off. It's not a big deal.
And that doesn't matter whether you're forced air or air conditioned. If you're air conditioned, you're going to be cleaning the cooling, well, or liquid with air exchangers. You're going
Yes.
to your heat exchanger rather. You're either going to be cleaning the coolant coils and fins, or you're going to be swapping out fan filters or replacing or cleaning them, depending on what kind you've got. So yeah, and that comes back to what you were saying earlier. A lot of this stuff is situational. I mean, out here in the East Coast, we've got dandelion fluff for a couple of weeks in May, June, but other than that, we don't have a lot of airborne stuff. But yeah, you hit June into July in the Midwest, you're dealing with cottonwood fluff on everything.
Sure.
Later in the year, August or so into Mississippi, it's cotton bolls and cotton fluff, different kind of cotton fluff, but the same deal.
Yes. Well, especially during harvest season. And you know, you go further west, you start having problems with dirt blowing in, sand, whatever, and that stuff can be just as bad too.
Oh,
Sometimes worse because it's harder to dislodge.
the clay silt that builds up if you're in the West Coast, clay dust.
Yeah.
Greg mentions we've added custom built bug screens in front of our coils as a pre-filter, easy to take off and rinse off the fluff and keeps the coils cleaner. And that's a good idea. Sometimes adding separate stages of filtration.
Yep. It's
Run into
as long as you keep up with the cleaning of them. Yes.
That's the critical part. And again, the need to actually visit the gear every now and again. We've done a lot of talk earlier on about deciding when to do backups, and there are a lot of budget options. And I mentioned Max Connect as a backup STL. I mean, in a pinch, you could use a Barracks Extreme or InStreamer and public internet. I wouldn't recommend it for full-time use necessarily, but again, depending on your situation, what fits the budget, you know. And a prime example, somebody who we both know quite well, recommended online the other day. Somebody was asking about UPSs, and they mentioned the Extreme brand of UPSs, the XPCC. Excellent UPS, I mean, bar none. But I mean, I'm running backups or APC backups here at the house. So just for grins, I looked up the Extreme 2 kVA, the rating I've got, and it was 4 times the price.
Oh yeah.
So, I mean, you get what you pay for. Sometimes you got to make the judgment call.
Right.
So that kind of ties to, and again, some of the things that we can do, the only investment is time. And sometimes a little bit of housework goes a long way. That's, I see you grinning.
It looks like some of the sites I've been in recently.
I don't think you've been you may have been to this
No, but
particular one, but
I don't think so. But it looks, you know, you're playing the same game.
yeah.
We
Well, it's one of those, stuff gets installed and you'll have multiple engineers and things get added, and you're just doing what you need to do to get stuff going and minimizing the impact to the on air. And after a while, somebody like me will walk in and go, "What's this?" And you don't tend to notice it because you're always working on it.
right.
But yeah, it can get ahead of you sometimes.
Well, absolutely, and particularly when you're constantly chasing fires and trying to put things out, and dealing with crises and whatever else, especially if you're walking into, years and years and years of neglect. I mean, that's just the way it is. When I first started, we had just, as part of a JSA or something, had acquired a small market AM. And this
Mhm.
place was built like in the 40s. They had moved the building a couple of times, but you walked into the back of the rack room and you couldn't get to the back of the rack. There was a stack of wire that was at least 3 feet high.
Yeah.
And we decided, okay, we're going to take you off this weekend. You're just going to be off for a couple hours. And we cleaned out all that stuff, got it all sorted out, got it back to the bare minimum so you could at least get to the back of the equipment.
Mhm.
And but I mean, that took, it was 4 or 5 hours of off-air time. We did it at night, so it wasn't a big deal. And I mean, it's a small market, so they're running automated after hours anyway. But
Mhm.
sometimes you just have to do it. There's
Yeah.
just, you can't let
Well,
it get to that point.
right. And I mean, as I say, this one was a challenge. There's multiple stations, one engineer, and they had a period where they went through a series of engineers, and everybody brings different skill set to the table.
Sure.
So like for me, I'm more of an RF guy. I mean, I know a lot of people that are stronger than IT than RF, and yeah, you kind of you do what you know how to do, and like we said, a lot of times we're putting out the fires instead of trying to keep the fires from burning to begin with.
Right.
And
Well,
speaking of
well,
keeping fires from burning,
yeah.
so
Oh, yeah.
anyway, I'll let you finish your thought there first.
No, well, the problem we have now is that, especially in small markets, you're relying more and more on contract engineers, and there's fewer of them to go around these days. So you've got a guy that's got maybe 40 signals or 60 signals he's responsible for. And sure, it always seems to happen after a storm, you're running ragged for days just trying to clean up the mess because you're dealing with years of neglect and everything else. And a lot of times there's just no time to pick up the pieces. So it's
Yeah.
just you're just running around for days putting out fires.
Hmm. And
So
I've made the argument over and over and over that everybody that walks into a transmitter site as part of their job should have one of these little FLIR and I don't care if it's a FLIR camera. I just like the FLIR brand ones because you can get the ones that'll plug directly into your phone and
sure,
turn your phone camera into an infrared.
there's a
But
company called Seek IR that makes a similar thing that's probably at a little bit lower price point.
I know the FLIRs are running about $300, give or take.
It's comparable, yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, for that kind of money, you can get the little handheld. I think Klein makes one now. I actually saw one at a site recently, and I'm like, this is a neat little gizmo. And I mean, for that kind of money, it would pay for itself in catching something like that.
Yeah, Curtis says, how much does FLIR pay me for all these plugs? And I think it's more a case, Curtis, of when the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. FLIR just happens to be the only brand that I know. Now
Right.
that I'm aware of Seekai here, I'll start flogging them a little too. But yeah, no, it's one of these tools that I don't think we can emphasize enough because yeah, I mean, this is the kind of thing you walk in, you take a picture of a closed box, you see something that looks like that, you already know that you got to open that box, and you don't even need to take the picture. You can turn the camera on and just wave it around while you're looking at the display.
Yep.
And yep, no, that looks hot. Should check that out. Lay your hand on it. Whoa, that is toasty. Open the box and see
Mhm.
something like that. So
Yep. And we had a similar situation in the first cluster of stations I worked at. I think it was like a 600 amp three-phase service that came into the building, and it was a disconnect very similar to that. And
hmm
I just had a habit of just walking into the building and just kind of walking around for 5 minutes and just put your hands on things and just listen and touch and take it in. And I touched the disconnect and it was hot. And I'm like, that's not normal. And I opened the box and saw very similar to what you've got in that picture there.
yeah.
And called up the chief and said, you better get somebody out here to fix this before the building goes. And
hmm
it it took them a while to get the parts for it, but we did get that thing changed out as quick as we could.
Yeah, and Daryl makes a good point. Make sure that the FLIR camera you want, and he says matches the iPhone, but whether iPhone or Android, because
Yes,
like my Samsung Galaxies, I've got had one that had USB 2, I've got one that does USB-C,
USB-C.
and then of course the Lightning adapter on the newer iPhones. So very much, yeah, make sure that whatever camera you get is matched to the phone you want to use it with. Um,
Yep.
Quick interjection, we're hitting near the top of the hour. We are going to run long as we always do. I would be ashamed to break an almost perfect record today. And I think we're at, unless you got somewhere you got to be at the top of the hour, in which case, well, I'll carry on without you. But this is again one of these conversations where we've historically talked about the physical plant, the things that get hot, the things that burn up, and we don't beat the drum. I don't think, well, we've been beating it a lot more recently, and I see Wayne Pacina in the audience, so I'm going to credit him for this slide because it's one I stole from him from one of his SBE presentations. But most of us, as I said earlier, have learned that learned the IT stuff just by osmosis, I guess, by being exposed to it. And I argue that I haven't learned anything right. I've just learned it the way I needed to learn it to make it work in the application I was using it in. So, and I mean, you're a Linux guy, and we had this conversation earlier because you had to go scrounge a computer to run this GoToWebinar platform, which doesn't like Linux.
Yep. Unlike the other ones, unfortunately.
Yeah. So, but again, same deal. And the funny thing is, like Windows 11, I just learned last night actually runs some Linux applications, or can run some Linux apps, and they're talking going further with the Linux kernel and Windows.
It could be.
So.
Yeah. The sad thing is, I know more about Linux these days than I probably do about Windows because Linux has been my daily driver for about the last 6 years.
Yeah.
And it was a learning curve, but I really like it now. I'm not sure I would go back to a Windows box unless somebody put a gun to my head.
Things can be arranged,
Yes, I
but
suppose. We can be
but
very
yeah,
persuasive.
yeah, and I mean it's the same deal. Like the younger boy here at the house, he inherited his mother's laptop, and he's growling that it wouldn't do what he needed it to do. Well, she owned it for a lot of years and had a lot of Windows things added and turned on, and so I just ended up blowing it totally out and putting I think a version of an Ubuntu kernel. But anyway, a version of Linux on it, loaded up Safari, taught him how to work that, and everything he does is
Off to
web-based,
the
so
races. Yep.
he's happy as anything.
Yep.
Side note, Dan mentions that Apple is moving away from Lightning to USB-C next year, so that'll be less of an issue for your FLIR. Then it's just a matter of having the right software to drive it.
Yep.
And again, whether it's Lightning connect cable or USB-C or is more vendor specific, but just something else that you always need to pay attention to. Will this connect to that?
Right.
So back to the IT security again, and I say I've been starting to beat this drum quite a bit more, and I'll go on to Shodan, my Internet of Things search engine that I like the best, and yeah, I don't get paid from them either, Curtis, but I'll go to Shodan and still find a couple of Nautel transmitters online, or a whole bunch of barracks units. Typically, you can find 1,500 to 2,000 barracks transmitter or barracks codecs online, and
Hmm.
a lot of them will be pre-2017 vintage when there was no default username and password assigned, so they're fully accessible. And I'm here to tell you, if I can get into a barracks box and it says STL blank 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 call sign, and I can see the little meters moving, there's not a lot to, if I was so inclined, to change me to porting it to my own audio source and then assigning a password.
Hmm.
Folks, you got to beef up the default logins. Got to. And that comes back to, and I beat this drum a little too, but virtualization and cloud-based. What are your thoughts on that?
I, to be honest, I don't know a whole lot about it. That's kind of outside of my realm. I let that be handled by people that make more money than I do.
And see, right off the bat, know your strengths. And
Yep.
but so this is something I've been beating the drum on quite a bit because, and I'll give you an example. Like I'm running this thing on my work laptop. If for whatever reason we get through this session and my work laptop blew up, I can grab my personal laptop. Almost everything I do is cloud hosted. So I can access all of it from any device. Now, the catch, if the internet service craps out, you'd better have local backups as well.
Yep.
So, belt and braces, don't rely on any one thing. And it comes back to the original conversation. Don't rely on any one thing, but how many people only have one transmitter with no backup?
Yep.
These days, whether it's our VX series, whether it's a Bext, whether it's an RVR, whether it's pick your brand of choice, compact. I mean, Gates Air makes the little, not the FLX, the low power faxes.
The
Um,
faxes, yep.
so, these things are frequency agile, they're lightweight. You could, let's see, I didn't include that slide, but thought I'd had. Oh, wait, back to backups. One more, no, I'm getting carried away. Here we go. But you could throw all this stuff into a Pelican case with like a Versatune antenna or one of the broadband penetrators. Versatune collapses into a flat pack. That's why I picked that. But you could have a whole transmitter site in about a 65-pound Pelican case ready to roll. And, or you throw a broadband one single bay on a pole at the studio, and then you've got full market backup with a frequency agile transmitter and maybe an AOIP codec of some sort to get audio to it from wherever. I think a lot of times we're relying too much on we're relying on 40-year-old technology. You may have a tube transmitter gone back forever and it's always worked, so you just keep it going. But we're not thinking about the fact that 40 years ago, you had 2 guys working full time at that transmitter site and 3 more working at the studio.
Yep.
So, what's your answer to that anyway? I mean, obviously, we need to improve the level of backups.
We improved the level of backups.
So I love it when I say it all, just feed you the lines. But
Uh-huh.
yeah, I mean, it's one of those situations where as we get further forward and we got fewer people doing more stuff, it's not like we can, we can't say, well, it's always worked this way, because when it always worked this way, we had a lot more people doing it.
Right,
And
and there's going to come a day when it no longer does, and that's when everybody gets caught with their pants down, and you're off the air for 3 days because nobody's got spare parts or whatever, or you can't get spare parts for that box anymore, and back to the previous point, make sure that if you do have backup systems, you test them, because what good is a backup that doesn't work? It's pretty much just a big paperweight.
yeah, I had a guy that called me about 2 weeks ago, and he goes, he goes, you sent me a quote on this transmitter a couple of years ago, and I said, yep. He goes, I need you to refresh that. And I said, okay, I can do that. There've been some price adjustments, but yeah, I can refresh it. And he goes, what's the delivery look like? And I said, these days, probably for that model, about 4 to 5 months. It's the bigger box, and it's, again, we get hit by the part shortages, same as everybody, no secret about that.
Yep.
And he's like, oh, well, we're in a jam, we're off the air. And I said, well, you probably should have bought this transmitter when I first quoted it 2 years ago, then it'd already
Yeah.
be there.
Yep.
But and I mean, of course, hindsight's 2020, but that's something that I've actually done sessions on. We are not typically, and I mean, most manufacturers to some extent or another, depending on the power level and the product, are going to have similar challenges. We don't turn products around overnight anymore or over a weekend. If for no other reason than the order books are so full that we just can't keep the inventory in stock.
Yep.
So, and you can't get the inventory anymore because, if GM orders 100,000 of this IC and I want 100, I'd be better off calling GM and asking them to order 100,000 and 100, and then I'll buy them from them for twice what they paid or whatever. The other thing that we do beat the drum on a lot is using the resources. And I mean, there's a Facebook group for everything. There's just a small section of some of the ones to the right that I frequent. And there are several others, broadcast trick pictures of transmitter sites, pictures of studios, Rivendell users group. You pick a topic, there's a Facebook group for it. You know, some have more value than others. There's a lot of fluff, but there's also a lot of good information. Barry Michigan's broadcast desktop resource, the virtual engineer. What am I missing? What do you use if you've got to go hunt something up, or do you just mostly go to the horse's mouth or whichever end of the horse?
Oh, one thing that's helped me a lot and has gotten me out of a lot of trouble is usually when I go to a site, I have a drive that I carry with me that's got manuals on it. Because a lot of times you go someplace, there's no documentation, it's been scattered to the wind, somebody took it home the last time they tried to fix it, and it never migrated back. And now I need to know what pins on this connector I need to fix the interlock problem or whatever's wrong with it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something that is a good thing. I mean, again, I was at that site doing a remote control install, what, 3 weeks ago, something like that. And there was no books at any of the sites, but so I just plugged in my drive and it's like, oh, AM1A, okay, here's the pinout.
Yeah,
This is what this
yeah.
does. This is what you need to do to turn it on and off, all that stuff. So these are easy resources. And I mean, thumb drives cost pennies these days. Just make sure that you have the documentation you need where you need it, and usually with you. So,
Mm-hmm.
and
And I mean,
and
that's one of the things, again, the plug for the offsite hosting. We're a Office 365 facility, but you
yep,
could use whether it's Dropbox or whatever. I
sure,
mean, and so I've got all of the handbooks for everything we have current and a lot of our legacy gear in PDF form on a OneDrive account that I can access from any device I've got.
yep.
So yeah, exactly. Quick shout out, Engineer Rivera from Veracruz, Mexico, just gave me a shout out in the comments. So hola, Engineero. It's always good when we've got friends coming in from all over. On that note, I think we've hit the highlights. This webinar, as with all webinars, will be archived, and you can find it for better or for worse on the resources tab on our website. YouTube channel, Waves newsletter, just saw one hit my email the other day. So always good to see those come out. And again, the broadcast desktop resource, the virtual engineering group, all the online resources. Don't be afraid to, I told somebody once, because people say, I got a dumb question. I said, the only dumb question is the one you already know the answer to. And you're just asking it to me, hoping that the answer will be different this time than it was last time. But otherwise, there are no dumb questions. If you don't know something, ask somebody. And the more people you ask, the more. If you ask 5 engineers, you'll get 8 different opinions, and usually a lot of them will converge. But so on that note, let's see. Oh yes, good point, Curtis. The newsletter said that I'm taking next month off of these, so August I am on the road till about the 18th or so. And we may end up starting to do these while I'm on the road, but I'm not quite there yet. So Curtis wants to know who said I could take a month off. It's the cool thing about being the boss of the webinars is I get to make that call. Anyway, but yeah, so we will not be doing any TTTs through August. We will be back in September. I'm not 100% sure what we'll be talking about, probably winterizing. Definitely fill out your little surveys and give me ideas. Tell me what you want us to talk about. I know we got a few of them that I've sort of been building up a little list, so we'll be working from that soon too. But absolutely, let us know. So on that note, Josh, I want to really thank you because so folks, we're mentioning Josh is a Linux guy, and to do this, we discovered that the GoToWebinar platform doesn't play well with Linux, and of course, in the having given him lots of warning, I think I asked him to do this last night at about 9 o'clock. So he had to scavenge a Windows computer about half an hour before we went live. So Josh, definitely thanks very much because I think you went above and beyond for this one.
No, appreciate that. Thank you for the opportunity.
And folks, as always, thank you all for being here. And let's see, yeah, so nothing else this month. August is a month off. We will see you again, hopefully early in September. Thanks. Have a great day. Bye now.
Bye bye.